In the quiet, hallowed halls of the Prado Museum in Madrid, she gazes out from the canvas, a ghost of light and innocence trapped in time. She is the sun at the center of a dim, cavernous room, the luminous heart of Diego Velázquez's masterpiece, Las Meninas. Her hair is spun gold, a pale, wispy halo around a face of porcelain perfection. Her eyes, wide and eerily solemn for a child of 5, meet the viewers with a directness that is both captivating and unnerving. She is the Infanta Margarita Teresa, a princess of Spain, dressed in an elaborate white and silver gown that seems to weigh more than she does. To the millions who stand before her, she is the epitome of royal childhood, a fairy tale figure immortalized by one of history's greatest artists. But look closer. Look past the shimmer of the paint and the master's genius. Look into those young, knowing eyes and you might see the shadow of a fate already sealed, a destiny as twisted and suffocating as the rigid corset beneath her silken dress. Visitors see a princess. They don't see the pawn. They see a cherished daughter. They don't see a biological commodity. They see an innocent child, but they cannot see the horrific destiny that was her birthright. A life predetermined by the twisted logic of royal bloodlines, a body cultivated for the sole purpose of an incestuous union designed to preserve a dynasty that was already eating itself from within. This is not a fairy tale. There is no charming prince, no happily ever after. The story of Margarita Teresa is an account of unimaginable suffering. It is the story of a girl whose womb was a matter of state policy before she could even read, whose health was sacrificed on the altar of political ambition, and whose brief, 21-year life was a relentless cycle of pregnancies, miscarriages, and pain. She was born into the House of Habsburg, a family so pathologically obsessed with maintaining its genetic purity that it had turned incest into official policy, a sacred duty that warped its bodies and minds. Her parents were uncle and niece. The man she was promised to from infancy was also her uncle. The innocent face in the painting is a mask, a beautiful lie that conceals one of history's most disturbing examples of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, turning the most basic human relationships, those of family and love, into instruments of exploitation, control, and ultimately torture. This is the story of the life that the painting hides, the horrific truth of the princess who was raised for incest. To understand the tragedy of Margarita Teresa, one must first understand the family that created her, the House of Habsburg. For centuries, their name was synonymous with power. They were not just a royal family. They were a multinational corporation of crowns, a sprawling enterprise whose influence stretched from the sun-scorched plains of Spain to the dense forests of Austria, from the wealthy lowlands of the Netherlands to the newly conquered territories of the Americas. The sun, it was famously said, never set on the Habsburg domains. Their ascent was not primarily won on the battlefield. While Habsburg armies did march, the dynasty's true genius lay in a far more intimate and insidious strategy. Their motto, which echoed in the courts of Europe, was Bella Gerent Alii, Tu, Felix Austria, Noobs. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Marriage was the Habsburgs' ultimate weapon. Through a breathtakingly complex and ruthlessly executed series of strategic unions, they absorbed kingdoms, neutralized rivals, and consolidated their power. A well-chosen bride was worth more than 1,000 cannons. The dowry of a princess could be an entire country, her womb a vessel for future territorial claims. In this high-stakes game of geopolitical chess, children were the most valuable pieces on the board, their lives and bodies mapped out from the cradle to serve the singular, overarching goal, the continuation and expansion of Habsburg power. In the early generations, this policy was a staggering success. Marriages connected the Austrian and Spanish branches of the family, creating a formidable Catholic bloc that dominated European politics. But as the centuries wore on, a dangerous obsession took root. The desire to keep their vast wealth and territories within the family became paramount. The pool of acceptable Catholic royals of equal standing was already small. Rather than risk diluting their power by marrying into other noble houses, the Habsburgs began to look inward. They turned their most effective weapon upon themselves. What began as a strategy of political consolidation slowly morphed into a systematic, near-religious policy of incest. The logic was as simple as it was perverse. To keep the bloodline pure and the power contained, they would simply marry each other. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. The web of consanguinity grew tighter and more tangled with each generation. A slow, self-inflicted strangulation. The Church, which strictly forbade such unions, was little obstacle. The Habsburgs were the staunchest defenders of Catholicism in Europe, the bulwark against the Protestant Reformation. They had the power and influence to secure the necessary papal dispensations, waivers that sanctified marriages that would have been condemned as sinful for any commoner. And so, the practice became not just accepted, but enshrined. The family tree of the House of Habsburg ceased to branch out. Instead, it curled back on itself, a twisted, gnarled vine, with each new generation being a product of ever-denser genetic overlap. The consequences were written on their very faces. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe mandibular prognathism where the lower jaw grows faster and longer than the upper, became a physical hallmark of the dynasty. This was not a mark of distinction but a sign of deep-seated genetic decay. In its more extreme forms, it made chewing and even speaking a painful, lifelong struggle. King Charles II of Spain, Margarita Teresa's half-brother, would become the tragic endpoint of this genetic experiment. His jaw was so deformed he could barely close his mouth, his tongue so large he drooled constantly, and he was plagued by a host of physical, mental, and developmental ailments that left him a virtual invalid. But long before the Spanish line met its grotesque end with Charles II, the seeds of its destruction were already sown. The relentless inbreeding led to staggering rates of infant and child mortality. For every Habsburg child who survived to adulthood, many more died in the cradle or were lost to miscarriages and stillbirths. The wombs of Habsburg women became battlegrounds where the dynasty's obsession with purity fought a losing war against the immutable laws of biology. This was the world into which Margarita Teresa was born. She was not simply a child. She was a potential solution to a looming crisis. Her existence was a political calculation, her future preordained to serve the needs of a dynasty that was slowly, inexorably, destroying itself from within. On July 12, 1651, the bells of Madrid rang out to celebrate a royal birth. Inside the opulent but stifling confines of the royal Alcazar, Queen Mariana of Austria, herself only a teenager, had given birth to a daughter. Her husband, King Philip IV of Spain, was not only her king but also her maternal uncle, a man 30 years her senior. The new princess, Margarita Teresa, was therefore not only the daughter of a king but also the great-niece of her own father. Her genetic inheritance was a concentrated cocktail of Habsburg DNA, a legacy of incestuous unions that stretched back for generations. Her dowry was not land or gold, but a perilous genetic lottery. For King Philip IV, the birth was a moment of muted relief mixed with profound anxiety. He was an aging monarch, burdened by the failures of his reign. The once mighty Spanish Empire was in a state of slow collapse, suffering humiliating military defeats in Europe and facing economic ruin at home. His greatest personal and political failure, however, was his inability to produce a healthy male heir. His first wife had died, and their only son, Balthasar Charles, a promising and intelligent boy, had perished from smallpox at the age of 16. Philip's marriage to his young niece, Mariana, was a desperate act of dynastic preservation. It was a union designed for one purpose: to create a male heir who could secure the Spanish throne and solidify the critical alliance between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family. But the curse of their shared bloodline haunted them. Mariana had already suffered through multiple miscarriages and the births of children who were too weak to survive more than a few days or weeks. And so, the birth of Margarita Teresa was greeted with a complex mix of emotions. She was a healthy, vibrant child, a small miracle in a family accustomed to loss. But she was a girl. The desperate need for a male heir remained unfulfilled. Yet, from the moment she drew her first breath, her value was already being calculated. She was another precious bargaining chip in the endless negotiations that constituted Habsburg foreign policy. The primary objective was clear. She would be betrothed to her other maternal uncle, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor and head of the Austrian Habsburgs. This marriage would be the ultimate expression of Habsburg dynastic strategy. It would unite the two main branches of the family, ensuring that if Philip IV failed to produce a surviving son, the Spanish throne and its vast empire could potentially pass to the Austrian line through Margarita Teresa or her children, preventing it from falling into the hands of their great rival, the Bourbon kings of France. Thus, Margarita Teresa's entire existence was a political instrument. She was a living treaty, a flesh and blood guarantee of a fragile alliance. The men who decided her fate, her father, her future husband, and their ministers, viewed her not with the simple affection one might have for a child, but with the cold, assessing eye of a strategist. They discussed her future as if she were a piece of territory to be bartered. Letters flew between the courts of Madrid and Vienna, dissecting the terms of a marriage contract for a girl who was still an infant. These were not discussions of love or compatibility, but of dowries, succession rights, and territorial concessions. Her health was monitored not out of simple paternal concern, but to assess her future reproductive capacity. Was she strong? Would she be fertile? Could her small body withstand the rigors of constant childbirth that would be demanded of her? The beautiful, golden-haired child who would later be immortalized by Velázquez was, from her first day, a prisoner of her own blood. Her life was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty, to the preservation of Habsburg power. The innocent gaze captured in the famous painting belies the heavy weight of this predetermined fate. While other children might be allowed dreams of their own, Margarita Teresa's future was a carefully constructed cage, gilded with the trappings of royalty but a cage nonetheless, from which there would be no escape. The Spanish court of the mid-17th century was a world of suffocating formality and rigid ritual. It was a place where every gesture, every word, and every public appearance was governed by an ancient and unyielding etiquette known as the Burgundian Protocol. Life in the royal Alcazar was a constant performance, a public display of majesty and divine right. For a child, it was a profoundly unnatural environment, and for Margarita Teresa, whose every move was weighed for its future political significance, it was a childhood lived under a microscope. From her earliest years, she was surrounded not by the carefree affection of a normal family, but by a phalanx of attendants, ladies-in-waiting, and tutors whose primary job was to mold her into the perfect royal bride and future empress. The famous painting, Las Meninas, offers a glimpse into this world. Margarita Teresa stands at its center, attended by her Meninas, maids of honor, her dwarf entertainers, and a large mastiff that sits placidly at her feet. In the background, her parents, King Philip and Queen Mariana, are reflected in a mirror, their ghostly presence a reminder of the constant royal scrutiny under which she lived. The artist himself, Velázquez, stands before a large canvas, documenting the scene, underscoring the sense that her life was a subject to be observed and recorded rather than simply lived. Her religious instruction was paramount, but it was a specific brand of piety, emphasizing the virtues of submission, sacrifice, and obedience to God's will, which, she was taught, was synonymous with the will of her family and the demands of the dynasty. Every aspect of her upbringing was calculated to maximize her value in the international marriage market. Her physical education was not for sport or enjoyment, but to develop the grace and stately bearing expected of a Habsburg princess. She learned to dance the formal, intricate steps of the court, to ride a horse with regal poise, and to carry herself with a dignity that belied her young age. This constant shaping came at a great personal cost. She was isolated from the outside world and from other children. She was never allowed to play with commoners, and even her interactions with other noble children were carefully managed. She could not form close, personal friendships that might conflict with her preordained destiny, nor was she permitted to express personal preferences that could complicate future negotiations. The natural charisma and intelligence that observers noted were qualities to be polished and displayed, not talents to be explored for her own fulfillment. Her body, like her mind, was being prepared for service to the dynasty. Physicians regularly examined her, not merely to ensure her health, but to monitor her physical development and reproductive potential. These were cold, clinical assessments of her value as a breeder. The doctor's reports, preserved in the court archives, discuss her body in purely functional terms, evaluating her capacity to bear children for the glory of the Habsburg dynasty. At no point in these proceedings was the young princess herself consulted about her feelings or desires. The decision about her future had been made before she could even speak. She was a child, yet she was already a pawn in a game far larger than herself, a game whose rules had been written by generations of ancestors and whose stakes were the survival of an empire. At no point in these proceedings was the young princess herself consulted about her feelings or desires. The decision about her future had been made before she could even speak. She was a child, yet she was already a pawn in a game far larger than herself, a game whose rules had been written by generations of ancestors and whose stakes were the survival of an empire. The premature seriousness in her eyes, so poignantly captured by Velázquez, hints at a child who was perhaps all too aware of her fate. A life that would not be her own, but a sacrifice for the cold, unyielding ambitions of the throne. As the years passed, the abstract political reality of Margarita Teresa's future began to take on a terrifyingly tangible form. The whispers of the court grew louder, the lessons in German etiquette more insistent. She was no longer just the Infanta, the king's cherished daughter. She was the designated bride, the future Empress, and the weight of that title began to press down on her slender shoulders. The primary vehicle for this transition was art. King Philip IV, a connoisseur and a man who understood the power of image, commissioned a series of portraits of his daughter. These were not mere family keepsakes. They were diplomatic envoys, painted declarations of her health, beauty, and, most importantly, her viability. Diego Velázquez, the master whose brush had already captured her innocent childhood, was again tasked with rendering her image. But now the sittings felt different. The playful atmosphere of Las Meninas was gone, replaced by a solemn sense of purpose. With each new portrait, Margarita Teresa was dressed in increasingly opulent gowns of silk, velvet, and brocade, adorned with jewels that sparkled under the studio lights. She stood for hours, her back held unnaturally straight by the rigid stays of her corset, her expression a carefully composed mask of royal serenity. She understood, with the unnerving intuition of a child raised in such an environment, that these paintings were not for her father's gallery. They were reports, destined for Vienna, for the eyes of the uncle she was to marry. She was being inspected from afar, her worthiness as an imperial broodmare assessed through the medium of oil and canvas. One portrait, painted when she was 8, shows her in a stunning pink and silver dress. Her golden hair is still bright, but her blue eyes hold a profound melancholy. There is a gravity about her that is unnatural for a child, a silent resignation to the role she was born to play. When this portrait arrived in Vienna, the response was enthusiastic. Leopold I, her uncle-fiancé, was said to be enchanted. He wrote to Philip, praising the angelic beauty of his future bride, his niece. But the letters that flew between the two courts, carried by couriers across a continent, spoke of more than just a child's beauty. They were filled with the cold calculus of power. Ministers in Madrid and Vienna haggled over the size of her dowry, a sum the bankrupt Spanish treasury could ill afford, and the precise wording of the clauses in her marriage contract. A key point of contention was the renunciation of her claim to the Spanish throne. It was standard practice for a royal bride to renounce any rights to her native crown, but in this case the clause was a delicate fiction. Everyone knew that Margarita Teresa's younger half-brother, the future Charles II, was a frail and sickly child. The unspoken understanding, the great hope of the Austrian Habsburgs, was that Charles would die without an heir, and through Margarita Teresa, the vast Spanish Empire would fall into their hands. Her body was the bridge over which an empire might pass. Her father, King Philip, was trapped in a web of his own making. He doted on Margarita Teresa, calling her "my joy" in his private letters. She was the one bright light in his increasingly grim and lonely life. To watch her being prepared for sacrifice, to be the one signing the documents that sealed her fate, must have been a private torture. Yet he was a king first and a father second. The survival of the dynasty, the grand, overarching imperative of the House of Habsburg, demanded it. He was a prisoner of the same system that was consuming his daughter. In 1663, when Margarita Teresa was 12 years old, the marriage contract was finally signed. The news was celebrated with formal court ceremonies, but for the young Infanta, it was the sounding of a death knell for her childhood. She was no longer a potential bride. She was a bride-in-law, bound to a man she had never met, an uncle who was a stranger. The portraits continued, but now they served a new purpose: to track her maturation, to assure the Viennese court that she was developing as expected, that the vessel was readying itself for its sacred, reproductive duty. The innocent child of Las Meninas was gone forever, replaced by a solemn young woman on the cusp of a horrific destiny. The ceremony that sealed Margarita Teresa's fate took place on Easter Sunday, April 25, 1666. She was 14 years old. The Chapel Royal in the Alcazar was a breathtaking spectacle of gilded splendor and religious solemnity. Sunlight streamed through the high stained-glass windows, illuminating clouds of incense that rose towards the frescoed ceiling. The highest nobles of Spain, dressed in their finest velvets and silks, filled the pews, their faces a mixture of political satisfaction and somber reverence. At the center of it all stood the Infanta. She was a small, fragile figure, almost lost within a magnificent gown of silver brocade, so heavy with embroidery and pearls that she could barely move. Her face, framed by a delicate lace veil, was pale and devoid of expression. She looked not like a joyful bride, but a beautiful, silent sacrifice being led to the altar. The groom, of course, was not there. In his place stood the Austrian ambassador, Count Harrach, a stern, middle-aged man who acted as proxy for Emperor Leopold I. It was to this somber representative that Margarita Teresa recited her vows. In a soft, barely audible voice, she pledged her life, her body, and her eternal obedience to a phantom, an uncle whose face she knew only from miniature portraits. When the archbishop placed the ring on her finger, it was a cold, impersonal act, a transaction being solemnized. The vows were not a declaration of love. They were the final clauses of a political contract being enacted. With that, she was no longer the Infanta of Spain. She was the Holy Roman Empress. The celebrations that followed were lavish, but they were not for her. They were for the Habsburg alliance, a desperate political maneuver by a declining empire. Margarita Teresa moved through the feasting and dancing like a specter, her smile a brittle, practiced thing. The title of Empress did not bring her honor. It brought the chilling finality of her impending departure. The months that followed were a blur of preparations for the long journey to Vienna. A massive entourage was assembled, a moving court of Spanish nobles, ladies-in-waiting, confessors, and servants who would accompany her. This retinue was her last link to home, a familiar bubble intended to ease her transition, but it also served as a constant reminder of the life she was being forced to leave behind. Her farewells were heartbreaking. She clung to her father, the aging king who was sending his joy away to a fate he knew would be difficult. She wept with her mother, a woman who had endured the same journey as a young girl and knew all too well the loneliness and fear that awaited her daughter. The departure itself, in the autumn of 1666, was a grand public spectacle. Her procession of carriages, guarded by hundreds of soldiers, crawled out of Madrid. All along the route from the arid plains of Spain, across the seas to Italy, and then over the Alps into Austria, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the new Empress. They cheered for the symbol of power and alliance she represented, oblivious to the terrified young girl huddled inside the ornate carriage. For Margarita Teresa, the journey was an agonizingly slow and arduous passage into the unknown. The changing landscapes were a constant reminder of how far she was from everything she had ever known. Each night, in a different strange castle or palace, she was surrounded by the formal, suffocating etiquette of her position. The Spanish faces of her retinue were her only comfort, but she knew that even they would eventually be replaced by the stern, unfamiliar faces of the Austrian court. The carriage that carried her was not a chariot of glory, but a gilded prison, transporting her from one cage to another, larger and colder one. She was traveling not towards a new life, but towards the beginning of her end. Vienna in the winter of 1666 was a city of stark contrasts, of imperial grandeur and biting cold, of Baroque opulence and rigid, austere piety. For Margarita Teresa, arriving after her grueling months-long journey, it was an alien world. The Hofburg Palace, a vast and sprawling complex of imposing stone, felt less like a home and more like a fortress. The air was thick with the unfamiliar sounds of the German language, and the faces that greeted her were formal and unsmiling. Her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, met her with the formal courtesy befitting their stations. He was 12 years her senior, a man known for his deep religiosity, his passion for music, and his somber, serious demeanor. He, too, possessed the distinctive Habsburg features, though less pronounced than those of his Spanish relatives. While historical accounts suggest he was not unkind to his young bride, there was no pretense of a romance. Their relationship was, from the very beginning, a dynastic duty. He was her emperor and her uncle. She was his empress and his niece, and her primary purpose was clear to everyone at court. Margarita Teresa's life in Vienna immediately fell into a relentless routine dictated by her new role. She was now the empress, and her body was a vessel of state. The expectation was immediate and overwhelming. She must conceive, and she must produce a male heir. The entire Austrian court, from Leopold himself down to the lowliest servant, was fixated on her reproductive function. Her daily life was placed under even stricter control than it had been in Spain. A team of Austrian court ladies, led by a formidable and unyielding chief stewardess, replaced her beloved Spanish entourage. These women were her new jailers. They monitored her diet, her exercise, her social interactions, and her religious observances, all with the singular goal of optimizing her for pregnancy. Her health was no longer her own. It was a matter of imperial concern. Palace physicians, their faces grim and their methods archaic, were a constant presence. They subjected her to a barrage of treatments designed to ensure fertility, many of which were invasive and painful. Bloodletting was a common practice, believed to balance the humors and prepare the body for conception. She was forced to consume a variety of bitter herbal concoctions and adhere to strict dietary restrictions based on medieval medical theories. For long periods, she was confined to her chambers, ordered to rest in the belief that physical inactivity would encourage a pregnancy to take hold. The emotional and psychological toll of this regimen was immense. Isolated, homesick, and surrounded by strangers who viewed her as little more than a womb, Margarita Teresa became increasingly withdrawn and melancholic. The spirited, intelligent child from Velázquez's portraits was fading, replaced by a sad, anxious young woman. She was a teenager, but she had been stripped of her youth. Her life was an endless cycle of medical examinations, religious rituals, and the crushing public pressure to fulfill her dynastic obligation. The court celebrated with frenzied joy when it was announced, just a few months after the wedding, that the 15-year-old Empress was pregnant. The news was treated as a victory for the Habsburg alliance, proof that their incestuous strategy had been blessed by God. But for Margarita Teresa, it was the beginning of a physical and emotional ordeal that would define the rest of her short life. The pregnancy was difficult, plagued by the very symptoms that had worried her physicians. She was constantly sick, weak, and in pain. The Austrian court's response was not sympathy, but intensified scrutiny. The health of the fetus was paramount. The suffering of the mother was a secondary concern, an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice for the good of the dynasty. In 1667, after a grueling labor, she gave birth. The child was a daughter, Archduchess Maria Antonia. While any birth was a cause for celebration, a palpable sense of disappointment rippled through the courts of Vienna and Madrid. A girl could not inherit the throne. The crucial task remained unfinished. And so, before Margarita Teresa's body had even fully recovered from the trauma of childbirth, the pressure began anew. Her husband, her ministers, and her physicians all made it clear. Her duty was not yet done. She had to try again and again until a male heir was born. The relentless, life-draining cycle of pregnancy and loss had begun. The joy that followed the birth of Archduchess Maria Antonia was as fleeting as a winter's day. A living child was a blessing, but the wrong kind of blessing. The dynasty needed a boy, an archduke, a future emperor. The wet nurses whisked the infant away to the royal nursery, while physicians gathered not to celebrate the mother's survival, but to discuss the Empress's swift return to fertility. Her brief respite was over before it had even begun. Margarita Teresa's life became a clinical regimen. The court's obsession with her reproductive cycle was absolute. Her ladies-in-waiting, acting as spies for the court, reported on every detail of her health. Her diet was a strange and often nauseating concoction of foods believed to promote male offspring. Her prayers were prescribed, her activities limited. The pressure from her husband, from the court, and from her own family in Madrid was relentless and suffocating. Within a year, the court's efforts were rewarded. In 1668, Margarita Teresa was pregnant again. A fragile hope flickered through the palaces of Vienna and Madrid. This time, surely it would be a son. But the pregnancy was even more arduous than the first. Her body, already weakened, struggled under the strain. She was plagued by fevers and persistent weakness. Then, in her 7th month, came the catastrophe. After a day and night of agonizing pain, she miscarried. The loss was a political failure. There was no time for a mother's grief. The disappointment at court was palpable. A cold, heavy silence that pressed in on her. The physicians, frantic to avoid the emperor's displeasure, redoubled their efforts. Their care became a form of torture. Her existence was now a clinical experiment in dynastic propagation. She was subjected to more frequent and debilitating bloodlettings to purify her system. She was forced to drink foul-smelling herbal tonics and was confined to her bed for weeks at a time, her body and spirit wasting away in the gilded gloom of her chambers. Her letters to her father in Madrid, once filled with the detailed observations of a young girl in a new land, now carried a palpable undertone of despair. She wrote of her loneliness, of her longing for the Spanish sun and the familiar faces of her youth. Her husband, Leopold, was not cruel, but he was a prisoner of the same system. He would sit with her, sometimes playing the clavichord to soothe her, his music a rare and gentle comfort. But even his affection was tinged with the weight of his duty. He was her kindly jailer, and the walls of her prison were built of love and obligation. The pattern repeated itself with sickening regularity. In 1669, she became pregnant for a 3rd time. The court held its breath. This time, she carried the child to term, but the result was another daughter, who died just a few days after birth. The collective sigh of disappointment across 2 empires was almost audible. The 4th pregnancy followed quickly in 1670. Again, the hopes of the dynasty rested on the increasingly frail body of a teenager. Again, the result was tragedy, a stillborn child. With each loss, Margarita Teresa faded further. The luminous girl from the portraits was now a gaunt, weary woman of 19, her body racked by the trauma of 4 pregnancies and her spirit crushed by the weight of failure. Her youthful radiance had been consumed, burned away by the fever of dynastic duty. She was haunted by the ghosts of the children she had lost and terrified of the next pregnancy that was inevitably expected of her. The golden hair was duller now, the once bright eyes clouded with a permanent sadness. She was no longer Margarita Teresa, a person with hopes and fears. In the cold calculus of the Habsburg court, she was the imperial womb and it was failing. By late 1671, Margarita Teresa was pregnant for the 5th time in less than 6 years. She was barely 20 years old. This pregnancy was, from the very beginning, a desperate gamble against a body that had already given too much. The constant cycle of conception, childbirth, and miscarriage had left her profoundly weakened. She suffered from a persistent cough and shortness of breath, a condition her physicians diagnosed as bronchitis, but which was likely a symptom of a severely compromised immune system. Her life was now confined almost entirely to her bedchamber. The opulent rooms of the Hofburg, once a source of wonder, had become her infirmary. The air was heavy with the scent of medicinal herbs and the low murmurs of physicians who stood by her bedside, their faces a mask of professional concern that did little to hide their rising panic. They subjected her to their full arsenal of futile treatments. More bleeding, more purges, and the application of hot plasters to her chest, which only made her breathing more difficult. Leopold, for his part, was deeply distressed. He spent hours by her side, his usual stoicism giving way to genuine anguish. He saw not just the failing Empress, but the young, frightened girl he had come to care for. He ordered the finest musicians in Vienna to play outside her chambers and had prayers said in every church in the city. But he was powerless. The machine he served, the dynastic system that demanded heirs at any cost, had already claimed her. His personal feelings could not compete with the political imperative that drove the entire Habsburg enterprise. As the winter of 1672 turned to spring, it became clear to everyone that the Empress was dying. Her body was simply shutting down. The pregnancy, which the court had once seen as its greatest hope, was now slowly killing her. Yet, even in these final, agonizing weeks, the focus remained on the unborn child. Court officials and diplomats hovered, their concerns not for the suffering woman in the bed, but for the political implications of her death. On March 12, 1673, Margarita Teresa went into a catastrophic premature labor. The delivery was a horrific ordeal that lasted for hours. The palace was filled with the frantic activity of physicians and the desperate prayers of priests, but it was all in vain. Mother and child, another daughter, died in the process. Margarita Teresa was just 21 years old. She had endured 6 pregnancies, given birth to 4 children, and lost all but one in the service of a dynasty that had consumed her. The aftermath of her death was the final, callous betrayal. There was grief, of course, but it was overshadowed by political necessity. Her body was barely cold before the marriage negotiations began anew. Leopold, I needed a wife who could provide heirs, and the Habsburg alliance still needed to be secured. The machine ground on, and Margarita Teresa, the individual, the young woman who had been sacrificed, was quickly forgotten, her memory replaced by the pressing need to find a new womb for the throne. Her funeral was an elaborate affair, a grand display of imperial mourning designed to project the power and prestige of the Habsburgs. But it was an empty spectacle. The individual woman who had died in its service was lost beneath the weight of ceremony. The tragic irony is that Margarita Teresa achieved an immortality her tormentors never could. The Habsburg dynasty she was sacrificed to save would crumble. The Spanish line would go extinct just a few decades later, plunging Europe into the devastating War of the Spanish Succession. The vast empire would be dismembered, but Margarita Teresa lives on. She lives on in the quiet hall of the Prado, her innocent, knowing gaze meeting the eyes of millions. In Velázquez's masterpiece, she is not a political pawn or a reproductive vessel. She is a child, captured in a moment of fleeting, luminous grace. The painting is a silent testament to the humanity that the system tried to erase. It is her posthumous justice. It forces us to see the individual, to remember the person, and to confront the horrific cost of a world that values power over people. The story of Margarita Teresa of Spain is a warning, whispered across the centuries from a gilded canvas, a tragic reminder that behind the grand tapestries of history, there are always real, human lives, often sacrificed for the ambitions of the powerful. Her enduring image is a quiet protest, a monument to the girl whose life was a form of torture, and whose art became her final, lasting rebellion. Grief was a luxury the Habsburgs could not afford. In the cold, calculating world of dynastic politics, the death of an empress was not so much a human tragedy as it was a strategic failure. The imperial womb was empty. The critical mission remained unfulfilled. And so, even as the elaborate funeral ceremonies for Margarita Teresa were being planned, the machinery of state whirred back to life. Leopold I, a man who had shown genuine affection for his young niece-wife, was now, above all, an emperor without a direct male heir. His personal sorrow was swiftly subordinated to his dynastic duty. Before the echoes of the funeral dirges had faded from the stone halls of the Hofburg, his ministers were already drafting lists of potential new brides. The search for a new, viable womb began at once. Leopold would marry again, and then again, ever in pursuit of the male heir the system demanded. He was as much a slave to the dynasty's imperatives as the young women he married. The most tragic echo of Margarita Teresa's fate was the life of her only surviving child, Archduchess Maria Antonia. She was the last of her line, a living embodiment of the fragile link between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs. Like her mother, she was a political asset from birth. Her childhood was a replica of Margarita Teresa's, an isolated, heavily supervised existence where she was groomed for a strategic marriage. She was promised to the Elector of Bavaria, Maximilian II Emmanuel, another union designed to counter the growing power of France. And like her mother, Maria Antonia's body was a battleground. She inherited the frail constitution of her inbred lineage. Married at 15, she, too, was immediately expected to produce heirs. She endured difficult pregnancies, her health deteriorating with each one. In 1692, after giving birth to a son, she succumbed to postpartum complications. She was just 23 years old, dying at almost the same age as the mother she barely knew. The curse had been passed down. Another generation of women sacrificed for a bloodline that was becoming a biological death sentence. The ultimate futility of Margarita Teresa's suffering was laid bare with the fate of her half-brother, King Charles II of Spain. He was the pathetic, tragic culmination of centuries of Habsburg incest. Known as Carlos el Hechizado, Charles the Bewitched, he was a grotesque caricature of a king, plagued by a host of physical deformities and developmental disabilities. His Habsburg jaw was so severe he could not chew his own food. He was impotent, epileptic, and suffered from spells of madness. He was the living, breathing proof that the dynasty had finally and irrevocably poisoned its own well. For decades, the courts of Europe watched and waited as Charles II stumbled through his reign, a feeble ghost rattling around the vast, empty palaces of a dying empire. The question of who would inherit his throne consumed continental politics. The very catastrophe that Margarita Teresa's marriage was designed to prevent, a war over the Spanish succession, was now inevitable. When Charles II finally died in 1700 childless, his last will and testament named a French Bourbon prince as his successor. The Habsburgs' worst nightmare had come true. The great prize they had sacrificed so many of their daughters to protect had slipped through their fingers. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, decade-long conflict that engulfed Europe in bloodshed and ultimately led to the dismemberment of the Spanish Empire. The system, in its obsessive quest to preserve itself, had engineered its own spectacular downfall. And what of Margarita Teresa? The empires and the kings, the ministers and the physicians, are all dust now. The political alliances they forged with her life have dissolved into the footnotes of history. The Habsburg dynasty she was born to serve has vanished from the thrones of Europe. All the cold calculations, the agonizing childbirths, the relentless pressure, the immense suffering. It was all for nothing. But Margarita Teresa is not gone. She remains, forever 5 years old, her gaze fixed on us from the heart of Velázquez's canvas. The artist, in his genius, accomplished what her family never could. He saw her. He looked past the Infanta, the Empress, the political pawn, and saw the child. He captured a flicker of her true spirit, her solemn intelligence, her fragile humanity, before the machinery of the state ground it into dust. Her image has outlasted the empire that consumed her. It has survived the wars fought in her name. Today, viewers stand before Las Meninas and are captivated. They see a beautiful, golden-haired child. But for those who know her story, the painting is transformed. It becomes a memorial, a haunting indictment of the system that destroyed her. Her direct, unwavering gaze is no longer just the look of an innocent child. It is the gaze of a witness, an eternal echo from a gilded cage, testifying to a horrific royal fate and the enduring, tragic cost of treating human beings as nothing more than instruments of power. In the profound silence of the museum hall, the princess finally has the last word. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more true hidden history stories.